Have you ever met someone who completely shattered everything you thought you knew about attraction, about beauty, about what your heart could want? Maybe you're from Chicago like our story tonight, or perhaps you're watching from somewhere else entirely, but I'd love to know where you're joining us from in the comments below. Marco Santangelo had never questioned his preferences before. At 32, he'd built his reputation on certainty, on decisive action, on knowing exactly what he wanted and taking it without hesitation. As one of Chicago's most powerful mafia dons, doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. His family had controlled the South Side for 3 generations, and Marco intended to keep it that way for 3 more. Which was why he found himself increasingly irritated by his cousin Dante's choice in women. The Sunday family dinner at his mother's house in Little Italy had taken its usual turn toward uncomfortable territory. Nana Rosa was questioning when Marco would finally settle down and give her great-grandchildren, while his mother fussed over the antipasto platter and shot meaningful looks at every unmarried woman within a 5-block radius. But it was Dante's announcement that had really set Marco's teeth on edge. "My girlfriend's coming to meet everyone next week," Dante had said, his face lighting up with the kind of dopey grin that made Marco want to shake sense into him. "She's incredible, Marco. Smart, funny, gorgeous. I think she might be the one." The family had erupted in excited chatter, but Marco had felt only concern. He'd seen pictures of Dante's girlfriend on social media. Keisha was undeniably attractive in her own way, but she wasn't what their family expected. She wasn't what their world demanded. "You sure about this, Kaus?" Marco had asked during a quiet moment on the back porch, where the scent of his mother's basil plants couldn't quite mask the underlying tension in his voice. "I mean, she seems nice enough, but you know how things work in our world. Tradition matters. Family expectations matter." Dante's expression had hardened. "What are you trying to say, Marco?" Marco had chosen his words carefully, even as his conviction rang clear in his tone. "I'm saying maybe you should think about what you really want. About what works. Black women, they're fine for what they are, but for marriage? For family? For the mother of your children? You want someone who fits, someone who understands our culture, our values. Someone who looks like she belongs in family photos." Even now, 3 days later, Marco could still see the disgust in Dante's eyes before his cousin had walked away without another word. But Marco didn't regret his honesty. Someone had to look out for the family's future, had to maintain standards. Beauty came in many forms, he supposed, but there was a certain classic elegance that belonged in their world, a refinement that spoke to generations of tradition and breeding. Marco adjusted his Italian silk tie as his driver navigated the evening traffic toward the Millennium Gallery in River North. Tonight's gathering was business masquerading as culture, the kind of high society event where Chicago's power brokers gathered to discuss territories and alliances over champagne and canapes. The gallery's monthly showcase had become neutral ground for the city's various family interests, a place where even rivals could meet without immediate bloodshed. The Bentley pulled to a stop outside the sleek glass building, and Marco stepped onto the sidewalk with the confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. His tailored charcoal suit fit his 6-foot frame perfectly, the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted. At 32, Marco had inherited his father's height and his grandmother's striking green-gray eyes, along with the kind of commanding presence that made rooms go quiet when he entered. The gallery's interior was all soaring ceilings and dramatic lighting, designed to showcase both art and the people viewing it. Marco recognized most of the faces immediately. The Torino family clustered near a massive abstract painting, the elderly Don Caruso holding court by the sculpture garden, various business associates, and their perfectly polished wives scattered throughout the space like expensive ornaments. But it was the woman standing before a Renaissance-era portrait who stopped him completely. She was tall, maybe 5'8" in heels, with the kind of posture that spoke of classical training or natural grace. Her dress was midnight blue silk that skimmed her curves without clinging, elegant and sophisticated in a way that would have made his grandmother approve. But it wasn't her clothing that held his attention. It was everything else. Her skin was deep brown, rich as expensive coffee, and seemed to glow under the gallery's carefully positioned lights. Her hair was pulled back in a low chignon that emphasized the elegant line of her neck and the delicate silver earrings that caught the light when she moved. She was studying the painting with the kind of focused intensity that suggested genuine knowledge rather than social posturing, her full lips slightly parted, as if she were having a silent conversation with the artwork. Marco felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with pure, undeniable attraction. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not with her. He'd just spent 3 days explaining to his cousin why women like this didn't belong in their world, why tradition and breeding mattered, why certain standards had to be maintained. The hypocrisy of his own reaction should have disgusted him. Instead, he found himself moving closer, drawn by something he didn't want to name. Provenance is everything in pieces like this, the woman was saying to a small group that had gathered around her. Her voice was warm and cultured, with the kind of easy authority that came from deep knowledge rather than practiced performance. This particular work spent nearly 2 centuries in private collections before the Medici family donated it to the Vatican. The brushwork in the background suggests it was completed during Botticelli's most productive period, likely between 1478 and 1482. Marco found himself genuinely impressed despite his confusion. This wasn't some art tourist repeating information from a guidebook. This was someone who understood the technical and historical significance of what she was viewing. The painting itself shows the influence of both classical mythology and emerging humanist philosophy, she continued, gesturing gracefully toward specific details. Notice how the artist has positioned the subject's hands to suggest both earthly power and divine grace. It's a perfect example of how Renaissance masters balanced religious and secular themes. Marco realized he was staring and forced himself to look around the gallery with practiced casualness. This was supposed to be a business evening, after all. He could see Vincent Torino watching him from across the room with obvious amusement, and the last thing Marco needed was gossip about his wandering attention. But his gaze kept drifting back to her. When she laughed at something one of her companions said, the sound was genuine and unself-conscious, nothing like the calculated tittering he was used to hearing at these events. When she moved to examine another piece, her grace was natural rather than performed. Everything about her suggested education, sophistication, and genuine passion for her field. It was exactly the kind of combination that should have attracted him, if only she had been someone else entirely. Marcus forced himself to focus on business. The Torino family had been making aggressive moves into his territory lately, testing boundaries and pushing limits. Tonight's gathering was supposed to be his opportunity to gauge their intentions and send a clear message about his own capabilities. He couldn't afford to be distracted by impossible attractions and inconvenient reactions. He made his way toward the bar, nodding to associates and accepting brief handshakes from various allies. The bartender, a young man who probably had no idea he was serving drinks to some of Chicago's most dangerous individuals, mixed Marco's usual scotch neat with professional efficiency. "Excuse me," a familiar warm voice said beside him. "Could I get a glass of the Barolo, please?" Marco turned and found himself looking directly into the most beautiful eyes he'd ever seen. They were dark brown with flecks of gold, intelligent and direct in a way that suggested she was used to being taken seriously. Up close, he could see the subtle makeup that enhanced rather than masked her natural beauty, the expensive perfume that suggested both sophistication and personal success. The wine choice impressed him too. Barolo wasn't for casual drinkers or people trying to show off. It was for someone who understood quality and wasn't afraid to appreciate it. The bartender reached for the wine, but Marco found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to do so. An excellent choice. The 2015 vintage they're serving tonight is exceptional. She turned to face him fully, and Marco felt that inconvenient jolt of attraction intensify. Her smile was polite but genuine, the kind of expression that suggested she was used to conversations with strangers but didn't find them burdensome. "Thank you," she said. "I have to admit, I was hoping they'd have something special. It's not often I get to attend events like this." Marco found himself genuinely curious about her answer. "What brings you here tonight, if you don't mind me asking?" Her expression brightened with obvious enthusiasm. "I'm actually the curator who assembled tonight's exhibition. This is my gallery, technically speaking. Zara Williams," she added, extending her hand with the kind of confident professionalism that belonged in boardrooms and university lecture halls. Marco shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the absence of rings. Zara Williams. The name suited her perfectly, elegant without being pretentious. Marco Santangelo, he replied, using the tone he reserved for legitimate business introductions. Recognition flickered in her eyes, though whether it was his name or his appearance that rang bells, he couldn't tell. In his world, reputation preceded everything else, and Marco had worked hard to ensure his preceded him in exactly the right ways. "The gallery is beautiful," he said, gesturing toward the main exhibition space. "You've created something quite impressive here." Pride and pleasure warmed her features. "Thank you. It's taken 3 years to build our reputation to the point where we could host events like this. Tonight represents partnerships with some of the city's most influential collectors and cultural institutions." Marco understood the subtle message. This wasn't someone playing at sophistication or using family connections to create a hobby business. This was someone who had built something significant through her own efforts and expertise. The contradiction between his attraction and his stated beliefs was becoming harder to ignore. Everything about Zara Williams suggested exactly the kind of intelligence, culture, and strength that he'd always claimed to value. The fact that she didn't fit his narrow definition of appropriate wife material suddenly seemed less like a disqualifying factor and more like evidence of his own limited thinking. Before he could examine that uncomfortable realization too closely, the gallery's atmosphere shifted in a way that made every instinct Marco possessed snap to attention. Conversations became more subdued, movements more deliberate. Even people who had no idea they were surrounded by dangerous individuals seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed. Marco's gaze found Vincent Torino immediately. The older man was moving through the crowd with obvious purpose, his usual lazy smile replaced by something sharper and more focused. Behind him, Marco could see at least 3 men who definitely weren't art enthusiasts, their positioning too strategic and their attention too professional to be coincidental. This was supposed to be neutral ground, but the Torino family had apparently decided to change the rules. Zara was still talking about the exhibition, her enthusiasm for her work evident in every word, but Marco's attention was now split between her safety and the developing situation. The smart thing would be to excuse himself politely and handle whatever Vincent had planned somewhere away from innocent bystanders and priceless artwork. But as Vincent's path through the gallery became clearer, Marco realized with growing concern that the man wasn't heading toward him at all. He was heading directly toward Zara. The first shots shattered the Renaissance portrait she'd been discussing just minutes earlier. Marco's training took over before conscious thought could interfere. In the split second after the gunshots erupted, he was moving, his body positioned between Zara and the source of danger even as his mind processed the tactical situation. Glass from the shattered portrait cascaded around them like deadly rain, and he could hear screams and running footsteps as gallery patrons scattered in every direction. Zara had dropped to the floor at the first shot, her wine glass abandoned as survival instinct overrode social conditioning. She was bleeding from a cut on her left shoulder where flying glass had found its mark, but she was conscious and alert. Marco could see her trying to make sense of what was happening, her intelligent eyes tracking the chaos around them with the kind of analytical focus that suggested she was fighting shock through observation. "Stay down," he told her, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Don't move until I tell you it's safe." She nodded without argument, and Marco felt a flicker of respect for her composure under pressure. Many people, even those familiar with his world, fell apart completely during moments like this. But Zara was thinking, calculating, staying functional when it mattered most. Marco risked a glance toward where the shots had originated. Vincent Torino and his men had taken cover behind a marble sculpture, their weapons drawn and their attention focused on Marco's position. This wasn't random violence or a message meant for later delivery. This was a direct challenge, a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The gallery had emptied quickly, staff and patrons fleeing through whatever exits they could find. Marco could hear sirens in the distance, which meant this confrontation had a limited window before police involvement complicated everything exponentially. Vincent had planned this carefully, choosing a moment when retreat would be difficult but extended engagement would be impossible. Marco drew his own weapon, the familiar weight of the Beretta bringing clarity to the situation. He'd been carrying concealed firearms since he was 16 years old, and the mechanics of close-quarters combat held no mysteries for him. But protecting Zara while neutralizing multiple threats in a space full of priceless artwork and civilian witnesses required a different kind of strategy. "Vincent," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the gallery space. "This is neutral ground. You want to discuss territory? We can arrange a proper meeting." Laughter answered him, harsh and without humor. "Territory discussions are over, Marco. Time for new management in this city." More shots followed, aimed with enough precision to keep Marco pinned behind the marble column where he'd taken shelter with Zara. Vincent wasn't trying to end this quickly. He was making a statement, demonstrating that the old rules no longer applied, that even neutral ground could become a battlefield when it served his purposes. Marco's phone was already in his hand, sending rapid text messages to his security team. Response would be swift, but not swift enough to prevent immediate danger. For now, he and Zara were on their own. Zara was pressing her hand against her injured shoulder, her face pale but determined. The bleeding didn't appear severe, but any wound in a situation like this was one complication too many. Marco needed to get her out of the gallery and somewhere safe, preferably before Vincent decided to escalate beyond warning shots. "When I say move, we're going toward the back exit," he told her quietly. "Stay low, stay behind me, don't stop until we're outside." She met his eyes directly. "Why are you helping me?" The question caught him off guard. In his world, protecting innocent civilians was simply what you did, especially when they were caught in crossfire meant for you. But looking at Zara, seeing the directness of her gaze and the underlying strength that kept her functional despite fear, Marco realized his motivations were more complex than simple duty. "Because no one deserves to get hurt over my business disputes," he said finally. "And because what's happening here is my responsibility to fix." Before she could respond, Marco was moving, his hand on her back as he guided her toward the rear of the gallery. More shots followed them, but Vincent's men were firing to intimidate rather than kill. This was still theater, still a demonstration rather than an execution. The back exit led to an alley where Marco's driver was already waiting, engine running and rear door open. Marco's security team had protocols for situations exactly like this, and following them had kept him alive for 15 years in a business where life expectancy was often measured in months. "Hospital," Marco told his driver as they pulled away from the gallery. "Northwestern Memorial, emergency entrance." Zara was examining her shoulder wound with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she was fighting shock through intellectual focus. "It's not deep," she said, her voice steady despite everything that had just happened. The glass was thin, probably from the protective covering on the painting rather than the frame itself. Even injured and traumatized, she was thinking like a curator, analyzing technical details as a way of maintaining control. Marco found himself impressed despite the circumstances. "We're still getting it looked at properly," he said. "And then we need to discuss your safety while this situation gets resolved." Her expression shifted, wariness replacing analytical calm. "What kind of discussion?" Marco chose his words carefully. "The people who just shot up your gallery weren't targeting you specifically, but they were targeting an event where I was present. That makes you a witness, and potentially a target, until this gets settled." She was quiet for several minutes as the city passed outside the car windows. Marco could practically hear her mind working, processing implications, and calculating options. When she finally spoke, her voice held the kind of professional composure that belonged in boardrooms and crisis management meetings. "How long are we talking about for resolution?" Marco appreciated that she was asking practical questions rather than demanding explanations he couldn't provide. "Hard to say exactly. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how far Vincent wants to push this and how quickly we can convince him that backing down serves his interests." The hospital emergency room was controlled chaos, the kind of environment where gunshot wounds and suspicious injuries were handled with efficient discretion. Marco's name carried weight even here, and Zara's shoulder was cleaned and stitched within an hour. 12 stitches, the attending physician told them. No nerve damage, no major vessels affected. "Keep it clean and dry. Avoid heavy lifting for at least a week." "You were very fortunate." Zara thanked the doctor with genuine gratitude, but Marco could see exhaustion setting in now that the immediate crisis was past. Shock and adrenaline were wearing off, leaving behind the reality of what had happened and what it meant for her immediate future. In the car afterward, Marco made the call he'd been dreading. My apartment isn't safe, he told her without preamble. Neither is yours, probably. I have a penthouse with security that can protect you until this situation gets resolved. Her silence stretched long enough to make him wonder if she would refuse outright. I don't even know you, she said finally. A few hours ago you were a stranger at my gallery opening. Now you're asking me to move into your home because people are shooting at you. Marco understood her hesitation. From her perspective, this was madness. But from his perspective, it was the only option that guaranteed her safety. I'm not asking you to trust me with your life long term, he said carefully. I'm asking you to let me keep you alive until the people who put you in danger are no longer a threat. Another long pause. Then, what exactly do you do, Marco Santangelo? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that could change everything. Marco had spent his entire adult life maintaining careful separation between his legitimate business interests and his family's traditional activities. Most people in Zara's world never had to confront the reality of what his world actually entailed. I handle conflict resolution for various business interests, he said finally. Sometimes those conflicts become more heated than anyone would prefer. Zara's laugh held no humor. That's certainly one way to put it. But she didn't ask him to stop the car. She didn't demand to be taken home, or to a hotel, or anywhere else. Instead, she sat quietly as they drove toward his penthouse, her hand pressed absently against her bandaged shoulder. Marco's building occupied half a city block in the Gold Coast, all glass and steel and understated luxury. The penthouse took up the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. It was designed to impress, but also to provide the kind of security that money could buy when privacy and protection were paramount concerns. Zara stood in his living room and slowly turned in a complete circle, taking in the space with the same analytical attention she'd given the artwork at her gallery. The furniture was modern without being cold, expensive without being ostentatious. Everything spoke to quality and taste, but also to the resources of someone who could afford exactly what he wanted. This is beautiful, she said finally. Not what I expected. What did you expect? She considered the question seriously. Something more traditional, I suppose. More obviously Italian. More stereotypical. Marco found himself curious about her assumption. What do you know about Italian-American families like mine? Probably less than I think I do, she admitted. What I've learned from movies and books and news reports. None of which are probably very accurate. Her honesty was refreshing. Most people either pretended complete ignorance or demonstrated knowledge that came from entertainment rather than reality. But Zara was acknowledging the limitations of her understanding without pretending those limitations didn't exist. The guest room is down this hall, Marco told her, leading her through the penthouse. Full bathroom, walk-in closet, whatever you need. My housekeeper can arrange for clothes and personal items tomorrow. Zara paused in the doorway of the guest room, and Marco could see her processing the reality of her situation. Everything was happening too fast, circumstances forcing decisions that should have taken time and consideration. Why are you doing this? She asked quietly. Really? Marco met her gaze directly. Because what happened tonight was wrong. Because you got hurt because of my business, and that makes it my responsibility to fix. And because... He paused, not sure how to articulate the rest. Because I don't want anything else to happen to you. He finished simply. Something shifted in her expression, wariness giving way to something more complex. She was seeing him as an individual rather than a symbol of danger, recognizing genuine concern beneath the circumstances that had brought them together. Thank you, she said finally, for protecting me tonight. For this. All of it. Marco nodded, not trusting himself to say more. Having Zara in his space was going to test every assumption he'd made about himself, every belief he'd held about what he wanted and what belonged in his world. But looking at her, seeing the strength and grace she'd maintained throughout an impossible evening, he found his old certainties harder to defend. The explosion outside her gallery the next morning confirmed what Marco had already suspected. Vincent wasn't content with making statements. He was preparing for war. The morning news footage of her gallery's destroyed storefront played on every local channel, and Zara watched it all with the kind of numb fascination that comes from seeing your life's work reduced to rubble and police tape. 3 years of building reputation and relationships, of carefully cultivating Chicago's art scene, and establishing herself as someone worth taking seriously, demolished in a matter of hours by forces she hadn't even known existed. Marco stood in the kitchen of his penthouse, watching her watch the destruction, and Zara could feel his presence like a physical weight. He'd been making phone calls since dawn, his voice carrying that particular tone of controlled authority that suggested he was managing a crisis with practiced efficiency. But between calls, his attention kept returning to her, and she could sense questions he wasn't asking, conversations he wasn't starting. The coffee he'd made her was excellent, rich and perfectly balanced in a way that suggested either expensive equipment or considerable skill. Everything in his penthouse spoke to the same attention to quality, from the marble countertops to the fresh flowers someone had arranged in crystal vases. It was the home of someone who appreciated beauty and wasn't afraid to pay for perfection, which made his attitudes toward her all the more confusing and infuriating. "Turn it off," Marco said quietly, moving to take the remote from her hands. "Watching it won't change what happened." Zara allowed him to switch off the television, but her anger was building rather than fading. "Easy for you to say. That wasn't your life's work getting destroyed because someone wanted to send you a message." He turned to face her fully, and she could see recognition of her fury in his green-gray eyes. "You're right. I'm sorry. That was thoughtless." His immediate acknowledgement of her pain should have mollified her, but instead it only intensified her frustration. How could someone show such genuine concern for her well-being while simultaneously harboring beliefs that should have made that concern impossible? "I heard you," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could consider their wisdom. "The other night at the gallery, before all this started, you were on the phone with someone, talking about your cousin's girlfriend, talking about women like me." Marco's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. Wariness, maybe, or resignation. "What exactly did you hear?" he asked carefully. "Enough," Zara replied. "Enough to know that you think black women don't belong in your world, don't fit your family's expectations, don't meet whatever standards you've decided matter for marriage and children and family photos." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither of them had been prepared to address directly. Marco moved to the window, looking out at Lake Michigan with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was buying time to formulate his response. When he finally spoke, his voice held a quality she hadn't heard before. Something rawer, less controlled. "You're right. I said those things. I believed them at the time." "At the time?" Zara challenged. "That was 3 days ago." Marco turned back toward her, and she could see something in his expression that might have been shame. 3 days feels like a lifetime when everything you thought you knew about yourself gets turned upside down. Zara waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. The anger was still there, but beneath it was curiosity about what could change someone's fundamental beliefs so quickly. "I was raised to think certain things mattered," Marco continued. "Family tradition, cultural preservation, maintaining connections to our heritage and our history. My grandmother came from Sicily with nothing but her determination to build something lasting in America. My father expanded what she started, made it into something powerful and respected. I grew up believing it was my responsibility to honor that legacy by making choices that reinforced rather than challenged it." Zara listened to the careful way he was choosing his words, the obvious struggle to articulate beliefs he was simultaneously defending and questioning. "And that meant marrying someone who looked a certain way?" she asked. Marco's jaw tightened. "That meant marrying someone who fit the image of what our family was supposed to represent. Someone whose presence confirmed our success rather than challenged people's assumptions about what we deserved." The honesty of his answer was both infuriating and oddly compelling. At least he wasn't pretending his prejudices had been based on anything noble or principled. He was acknowledging them as the shallow, image-driven preferences they had always been. But hearing him articulate it so clearly also crystallized her own anger in ways she hadn't expected. "Do you have any idea what it's like?" she asked, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain composure. "To spend your entire career proving you belong in spaces where people assume you don't? Do you know how exhausting it is to be twice as prepared as everyone else because you know you'll be judged twice as harshly?" Marco was listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested her words were having an impact. But Zara wasn't finished. "I've been the only black curator at every institution where I've worked. I've smiled politely while collectors questioned my expertise Because my presence challenged their assumptions about what art professionals should look like. I've had to prove my knowledge and credentials over and over again while watching white colleagues be taken at face value. And now you're telling me that even after seeing my education, my work, my gallery, my expertise, your first instinct was still to categorize me as someone who doesn't fit? She was standing now, pacing the length of his living room with the kind of restless energy that comes from finally articulating long-suppressed frustrations. Marco watched her movement, and when he spoke his voice was quiet but clear. You're absolutely right. About all of it. And I'm ashamed that it took nearly losing you to make me question beliefs I should have examined years ago. Something in his tone made her stop pacing and look at him directly. When I saw you at the gallery, Marco continued, I was attracted to you immediately. Not despite your race, but to you as a complete person. Your intelligence, your passion for your work, the way you commanded respect from everyone around you. Everything about you challenged what I thought I wanted, what I thought I valued. And instead of questioning my assumptions, I tried to rationalize my attraction in ways that preserved my prejudices. The admission hung between them, raw and undefended. But watching you last night, seeing your strength under pressure, the way you've handled an impossible situation with grace and courage, I realized my beliefs weren't protecting tradition or family honor. They were protecting my own narrow thinking from being challenged. Zara studied his face, looking for signs of performance or manipulation. But what she saw was genuine discomfort with his own past attitudes, real struggle with changing deeply ingrained patterns of thought. Words are easy, she said finally, especially when circumstances make them convenient. Marco nodded. You're right to be skeptical. I can't undo what I believed or what I said. I can only try to prove that I'm capable of learning from my mistakes. Before Zara could respond, Marco's phone was ringing with a tone that suggested family rather than business. She watched his expression shift as he answered, tension replacing vulnerability with practiced speed. Ma, what's wrong? Marco listened for several moments, his jaw tightening with each word he heard. No, absolutely not. I don't care what Uncle Tony thinks. She's staying here until the situation is resolved, and that's final. Zara could hear raised voices on the other end of the call, rapid Italian mixed with angry English. Marco's responses became increasingly terse, and she realized she was witnessing exactly the kind of family pressure he'd described. Because she's my responsibility now, Marco said firmly. Because what happened to her gallery is my fault, and I'm going to fix it. And because anyone who has a problem with my choices can discuss it with me directly. More arguing followed, but Marco's position didn't waver. Finally, he ended the call and turned back toward Zara with obvious frustration. My mother heard about last night, he said. She's concerned about the family's reputation if I'm seen protecting someone who doesn't fit their expectations. My uncle thinks I should arrange for your protection through other channels. Maintain appropriate distance. Zara felt her anger return, sharper this time because it was directed at people who were making judgments about her without even meeting her. And what do you think? She asked. Marco met her gaze directly. I think anyone who judges you without knowing you isn't worth listening to. And I think if my family can't accept that I make my own decisions about who deserves my protection and respect, then they need to adjust their expectations rather than demanding I abandon my principles. The statement was delivered with absolute conviction, and Zara realized this was the moment of real connection she'd been waiting for. Not his apologies for past prejudices, but his willingness to defend her against ongoing ones. Something shifted between them, the anger and wariness giving way to recognition of mutual respect. Marco was proving his words with actions, choosing her dignity over family approval in real time. The space between them seemed to shrink as they looked at each other, awareness replacing argument. Zara could see the exact moment when Marco's attention moved from her words to her face, when intellectual connection became something more immediate and physical. He moved closer, slowly enough that she could have stepped away if she'd wanted to. Instead, she found herself studying the way afternoon light brought out gold flecks in his eyes, the way his height made her feel both delicate and protected. Zara, he said quietly, and she could hear question and hope and desire all tangled together in her name. She was just leaning toward him, just beginning to close the distance between them, when his phone rang again with the harsh urgency that meant business rather than family. Marco answered with obvious reluctance. but his expression changed rapidly as he listened. When? How long ago? No, don't do anything until I get there. I'm bringing backup. He ended the call and looked at Zara with an expression that combined fury and concern in equal measure. They took your assistant, he said. Sarah Chun. Vincent's people grabbed her from her apartment an hour ago and left a message saying they want to discuss terms. Sarah Chun had been Zara's assistant for 2 years, a brilliant art history graduate who'd turned down museum positions to help build something new and exciting in Chicago's contemporary art scene. The thought of her frightened and helpless because of Zara's association with Marco made rage burn in places Zara hadn't known existed. You can't go, she told Marco as he checked his weapon with practiced efficiency. This is obviously a trap. They're using Sarah to get to you. Marco's expression was grim but determined. Of course it's a trap, but that doesn't change the fact that an innocent woman is in danger because of my business. Sarah didn't choose to get involved in this war. Zara watched him holster the Beretta beneath his jacket, noting the way his movements held both deadly competence and careful restraint. Everything about Marco in crisis mode spoke to years of experience with violence, but also to a code that prioritized protecting the innocent over personal safety. Then I'm coming with you, she said. Absolutely not. Marco's voice carried the kind of authority that was clearly meant to end discussion. You stay here where it's safe. My team knows how to handle situations like this. Zara felt her own determination crystallize in response to his dismissal. Sarah is my friend and my responsibility. She's scared and she doesn't understand what's happening to her. If there's any chance my presence can help negotiate her release, then I'm going. Marco studied her face with obvious frustration. This isn't a boardroom negotiation, Zara. These are people who kill for business advantages. If something goes wrong, I can't guarantee your safety. The concern in his voice was genuine, and Zara recognized that his reluctance came from care rather than control. But her mind was made up. Sarah took this job because she believed in what we were building together, she said quietly. She trusted me to create something worth her talent and dedication. I'm not abandoning her now because it's dangerous. Something shifted in Marco's expression, recognition of her loyalty and courage overriding his protective instincts. After a long moment, he nodded reluctantly. Stay behind me at all times. Do exactly what I tell you without argument. And if I tell you to run, you run and don't look back. The warehouse where Vincent had chosen to conduct his negotiation was exactly the kind of cliché location that made Zara wonder if criminals watched too many movies. Industrial, isolated, full of shadows and empty containers that could hide any number of threats. Marco's security team had arrived first, positioned strategically around the perimeter with the kind of professional competence that suggested extensive military or law enforcement backgrounds. Sarah was tied to a chair in the center of the main floor, obviously terrified but unharmed. Vincent Torino stood beside her with theatrical casualness, flanked by 2 men whose positioning and alertness marked them as serious professionals rather than movie stereotypes. Marco, Vincent called out as they entered the warehouse. Good of you to join us. And you brought a guest. How considerate. Zara felt Marco's tension increase at Vincent's tone, but his own voice remained calm and controlled. You wanted to discuss terms. Let's discuss them. But first, you release the woman who has nothing to do with our disagreement. Vincent's smile held no warmth. Oh, but she has everything to do with our disagreement. She works for your new friend here, and your new friend has become quite the complication in our business relationship. Marco moved slightly, positioning himself between Zara and Vincent's men. What do you want, Vincent? Territory redistribution, Vincent said easily. Your docks, your import connections, 40% of your legitimate business interests. In exchange, I forget about your recent change in personal preferences, and we all move forward peacefully. The insult was delivered with calculated precision, designed to provoke exactly the kind of emotional response that led to tactical mistakes. Zara could feel Marco's fury radiating through his controlled posture, but his voice remained steady. My personal life isn't subject to negotiation. Release Sarah Chun and we can discuss business arrangements that benefit everyone. Vincent laughed, and the sound held genuine amusement. Personal life? Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the great Marco Santangelo has developed a weakness for something that doesn't belong in his world. Before Marco could respond, Zara stepped forward. Her heart was racing. but her voice came out clear and strong. "I belong wherever I choose to belong," she said firmly. "And right now, I choose to stand with someone who has the honor and courage to protect people who can't protect themselves." The warehouse went very quiet. Vincent's amusement faded as he reassessed the situation, recognizing that Zara wasn't going to be intimidated into compliance. Marco's response was swift and decisive. The negotiation dissolved into action as his security team moved with coordinated precision. Vincent's men were professionals, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Within minutes, Sarah was free and Vincent was face down on the concrete floor with zip ties securing his wrists. The drive back to Marco's penthouse was quiet except for Sarah's occasional sniffles as the shock began wearing off. Zara held her friend's hand and murmured reassurances, but her attention kept drifting to Marco's profile as he stared out at the city lights. She'd watched him handle a life-threatening situation with the kind of calm competence that spoke to both intelligence and experience. But more than that, she'd seen his immediate prioritization of innocent lives over strategic advantages, his willingness to take personal risks to ensure Sarah's safety. Everything about the evening had demonstrated exactly the kind of honor and protective instinct that challenged every assumption she'd made about men in his world. After Sarah was safely delivered to her sister's house, with round-the-clock protection arranged, Marco and Zara returned to the penthouse in contemplative silence. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind emotional exhaustion and the weight of everything that had happened over the past 3 days. "I owe you an apology," Marco said as they stood in his living room, the city lights creating patterns on the hardwood floors. "Not just for my previous attitudes, but for the way those attitudes put you and Sarah in danger." Zara studied his face, seeing genuine regret and something deeper that might have been self-recrimination. "Your beliefs didn't create Vincent's violence," she said carefully. "That's his choice and his responsibility." Marco shook his head. "My prejudices made me dismiss the possibility that someone like you could belong in my world, could be worth protecting and respecting. If I'd been honest about my attraction from the beginning, if I'd acknowledged what I was feeling instead of fighting it, maybe we could have avoided some of what happened tonight." The admission hung between them, raw and undefended. Zara could see the struggle in his expression, the genuine effort to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. "What are you feeling?" she asked quietly. Marco moved closer, his green-gray eyes holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That everything I thought I knew about what I wanted was wrong," he said. "That watching you tonight, seeing your courage and loyalty and strength, made me realize I've been a fool for believing that worth could be determined by something as superficial as appearance." He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face gently in his hands. "I'm feeling that you're the most beautiful, intelligent, remarkable woman I've ever met, and that I was too blinded by my own limited thinking to see it clearly from the beginning." Zara felt something shift deep in her chest, walls she'd built to protect herself from exactly this kind of vulnerability beginning to crumble. "I'm feeling," Marco continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, "that I want to spend whatever time you'll give me proving that I'm capable of being the kind of man who deserves your respect and attention." The space between them disappeared as Zara rose on her toes to meet his kiss. It was gentle at first, tentative, a question asked and answered. But when she pressed closer, her hands sliding into his dark hair, he responded with the kind of restrained passion that spoke to careful control rather than lack of desire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the kiss alone warranted, Zara could see her own surprise reflected in his eyes. The connection between them was deeper than physical attraction, more complex than simple chemistry. "Are you sure about this?" Marco asked, his hands still framing her face. "Because once we cross this line, everything changes. There's no going back to polite distance and professional courtesy." Zara considered the question seriously, acknowledging the weight of what he was asking. Getting involved with Marco meant accepting his world, his dangers, his complications. It meant trusting him with vulnerabilities she'd spent years protecting. But it also meant embracing the most genuine connection she'd felt with anyone in years, the kind of partnership that challenged both of them to become better versions of themselves. "I'm sure," she said simply. "I want this. I want you." Marco's response was immediate and thorough, his mouth finding hers again with renewed confidence. This time there was nothing tentative about his touch, nothing hesitant about the way he drew her closer. When he lifted her, Zara wrapped her legs around his waist with complete trust, allowing him to carry her toward his bedroom. The gesture was both protective and possessive, caring and claiming, everything she'd been afraid to want from someone whose world was built on power and control. His bedroom was as carefully designed as the rest of the penthouse, all clean lines and expensive textures. But Zara barely noticed the decor because all her attention was focused on the way Marco was looking at her, like she was something precious and necessary and long-awaited. He set her down beside his bed with the kind of care that suggested reverence rather than urgency. When he reached for the hem of her sweater, he paused, waiting for permission. "Yes," Zara said, understanding the question without needing it voiced. What followed was the most thorough and generous intimate experience of Zara's life. Marco approached her body like a problem to solve, a mystery to unravel, paying attention to every response and reaction with the kind of focused intensity that left her breathless and demanding and ultimately undone. When he finally moved above her, their eyes locked and their breathing synchronized, Zara felt completion that went far beyond physical satisfaction. This was partnership, recognition, the melding of two people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were missing. Afterward, they lay tangled together in comfortable silence, skin cooling and heartbeats gradually returning to normal. Marco traced patterns on her shoulder with gentle fingers, and Zara marveled at how safe she felt in the arms of someone whose life was built on danger. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words surprising her with their clarity and conviction. Marco's hand stilled against her skin. "Even though I've been an arrogant fool about things that should have mattered? Because you've proven capable of growth and change," Zara corrected. "Because you chose to protect me even when it complicated your life. Because you listened when I challenged your assumptions instead of dismissing me for being inconvenient." Marco turned so they were facing each other, his expression serious and unguarded. "I love you too," he said, "more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. You've changed everything I thought I wanted for my future." Before Zara could respond, Marco's phone rang with the harsh urgency that had come to signal serious problems. He reached for it reluctantly, his expression shifting as he read the message. "Vincent made bail 2 hours ago," he said grimly. "He's demanding a face-to-face meeting tomorrow night. Says if I don't come alone, he'll make sure everyone I care about becomes a target." Zara felt ice settle in her stomach as she realized their peaceful moment had ended before it had really begun. The meeting location Vincent had chosen was the same warehouse where he'd held Sarah captive, a choice that spoke to arrogance rather than strategy. Marco studied the building plans Zara had spread across his dining room table, noting exit routes and sight lines with the kind of tactical thinking that had kept him alive for 15 years. But it was Zara's insights that proved most valuable. "Vincent's weakness has always been his need to be seen as legitimate," she said, pointing to newspaper clippings she'd researched throughout the morning. "He's been trying to break into art acquisition for years, buying pieces to establish cultural credibility. But he doesn't understand the market well enough to avoid being cheated." Marco looked up from the building schematics. "How does that help us?" Zara's smile held the kind of satisfaction that came from solving complex puzzles. "Because 3 months ago, he bought what he thought was a lost Caravaggio from a dealer I know is selling forgeries. Vincent paid $8 million for a painting worth maybe $8,000. If that information became public knowledge, it would destroy his reputation as a serious collector and legitimate businessman." The implications clicked into place immediately. Social humiliation was often more devastating than financial loss for men like Vincent, whose power depended heavily on respect and perception. "You think he'd back down to protect his reputation?" Marco asked. "I think he'd back down to protect $8 million and avoid looking like a fool in front of every art dealer in Chicago," Zara corrected. "Especially if the exposure came with evidence of his other questionable acquisitions." Marco felt admiration mixed with love as he watched her mind work through the strategic possibilities. She wasn't just intelligent. She was thinking like a partner, like someone invested in their shared success rather than her own safety. His phone rang before he could respond, and Marco's expression darkened as he recognized his mother's number. "Marco, tesoro," his mother began in rapid Italian before switching to English. You must listen to reason. This woman, whatever her attractions, she doesn't belong in our family. Uncle Tony has spoken to Don Caruso, and they agree you're making a terrible mistake. Ma, Marco interrupted firmly. I'm not discussing this anymore. Zara is staying in my life, and the family needs to accept that. But what will people think? What will they say about the Santangelo name? His mother continued, her voice rising with distress. Marco looked across the table at Zara, who was listening to the conversation with obvious discomfort but no surprise. She'd expected this resistance, had probably experienced variations of it throughout her professional life. They'll say I'm smart enough to recognize quality when I see it, Marco replied. They'll say I chose a woman who's accomplished, intelligent, and strong enough to be a true partner rather than an ornament. More rapid Italian followed, multiple voices joining the conversation as other family members weighed in. Marco listened with growing frustration until his grandmother's voice cut through the chaos. Bring her to Sunday dinner, Nana Rosa said firmly. Let me meet this woman who has turned my grandson's world upside down. Then we'll see what we see. The line went quiet as everyone processed this unexpected development. Marco's grandmother had the final word on all family matters, and her invitation was effectively a command. Sunday, 1 o'clock, Nana Rosa continued. Don't be late. After ending the call, Marco looked at Zara with a mixture of apology and concern. You don't have to do this. Family politics shouldn't be your responsibility. Zara straightened in her chair with the kind of determination he'd come to recognize and admire. If we're building a future together, then your family is part of that future. I'd rather face their disapproval directly than let it fester in the background. Marco's love for her intensified as he watched her prepare to walk into what would certainly be a challenging situation. She was choosing to fight for their relationship rather than take the easier path of avoidance. The warehouse meeting that evening unfolded exactly as they'd planned. Vincent arrived with theatrical confidence, clearly expecting to intimidate Marco into submission through superior positioning and implied threats. But when Marco presented evidence of the forged Caravaggio along with documentation of Vincent's other questionable art purchases, the older man's arrogance crumbled rapidly. You're bluffing, Vincent said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marco smiled without warmth. Call my bluff. Explain to Don Caruso and the other families how you've been throwing around millions on fake paintings while claiming to be a sophisticated businessman. The negotiation that followed was swift and decisive. Vincent agreed to withdraw from Marco's territory and cease all harassment of Zara and her associates. In exchange, Marco would keep the information about Vincent's art collection private, allowing the older man to save face while ending the conflict. As they drove away from the warehouse, Zara reached for Marco's hand with obvious relief. It's over? She asked. It's over, Marco confirmed. Vincent knows he's beaten. He won't risk public humiliation by continuing this fight. But even as he said it, Marco's mind was already moving toward the future they could now build together. The external threat had been neutralized, but the internal challenges remained. His family, his world, the expectations and traditions that had shaped his entire life. Sunday dinner at his grandmother's house was exactly as challenging as Marco had expected. His mother fussed and worried. His uncles made pointed comments about tradition and appropriate choices, and his cousins watched the proceedings with obvious fascination. But Nana Rosa, the tiny woman who commanded absolute respect from 3 generations of Santangelo men, studied Zara with sharp eyes and asked pointed questions about her education, her work, and her intentions regarding Marco's future. You built a business from nothing? Nana Rosa asked, her accent still thick after 60 years in America. Yes, ma'am. 3 years from concept to opening night. Zara's voice was respectful but confident, neither defensive nor apologetic. And you support yourself through this business? Completely. I haven't taken money from family or anyone else since graduate school. Nana Rosa nodded approvingly. Good. A woman should know her own worth, should contribute something meaningful to the world. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from Zara's family background to her opinions on art preservation and cultural education. Marco watched his grandmother gradually warm to Zara's intelligence and obvious respect for knowledge and achievement. When Nana Rosa finally announced her verdict, the entire table fell silent. She'll do, the elderly woman said firmly. She has strength and intelligence, and she makes my grandson happy. That's enough for me. Marco felt relief wash through him as his family's resistance began crumbling in the face of his grandmother's approval. Not everyone would accept Zara immediately, but Nana Rose's blessing provided the foundation for eventual acceptance. Later, as they walked along Lake Michigan under stars that somehow seemed brighter than before, Marco stopped and turned to face Zara directly. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, his heart racing despite his confidence in her answer. Zara looked at him with curiosity and growing awareness as he dropped to one knee on the lakefront path. "Zara Williams, you've changed everything I thought I knew about love, about partnership, about what makes a life worth living. You've shown me that real beauty comes from intelligence and courage and compassion, not from fitting into narrow expectations or maintaining artificial standards." He pulled out the ring he'd chosen that afternoon, a stunning sapphire surrounded by diamonds that reminded him of her eyes in candlelight. "Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me that honors both our backgrounds while creating something entirely new?" Zara's smile was brilliant as she held out her left hand. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it. To building something new together, to facing whatever challenges come next as partners, to proving that love is stronger than prejudice." As Marco slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her deeply, he marveled at how completely his world had transformed. 3 weeks ago, he'd been certain he knew exactly what he wanted for his future. Now, holding the woman he loved beneath Chicago stars, he realized his previous vision had been impossibly small. This was what he'd been waiting for without knowing it. A partner who challenged him to become better while accepting who he was, someone whose strength complemented his own, a love that honored both tradition and progress. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and grinning like teenagers, Zara looked down at her ring with obvious delight. "It's perfect," she said. "You're perfect. This is perfect." Marco laughed, pulling her close again. "We're perfect together. Everything else we'll figure out as we go." As they walked back toward his car, hand in hand and finally, completely committed to their shared future, Marco felt a peace he'd never experienced before. The external threats were resolved. His family was beginning their acceptance, and the woman he loved had chosen to build a life with him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but they'd face them together. The wedding planning process revealed truths about both their families that Zara hadn't expected. Her mother, who had initially been skeptical about Marco's background and concerned about her daughter's safety, found herself charmed by his obvious devotion and respectful attention to every detail that mattered to Zara. Marco's family, led by Nana Rose's enthusiastic approval, embraced the opportunity to demonstrate their sophistication and cultural appreciation through a celebration that honored both Italian and African-American traditions. 6 months after the proposal, they stood before 300 guests in the renovated gallery space that had become the symbol of their love story. The venue had been restored to even greater beauty than before, with reinforced security and expanded exhibition areas that showcased both classical European masters and contemporary African-American artists. Zara's dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk and delicate beadwork, designed by a Chicago artist whose work she'd championed since opening the gallery. Her natural hair was styled in elegant locks adorned with pearls that had belonged to Marco's great-grandmother, a gesture of acceptance from his family that had moved her to tears during the ceremony rehearsal. Marco looked magnificent in his custom Italian tuxedo, his green-gray eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle accompanied by both her father and Dante, who had reconciled with his cousin months earlier when Marco publicly acknowledged the wisdom of Dante's relationship choices. The ceremony itself blended traditions beautifully, with Italian blessings woven together with African-American jumping the broom traditions and contemporary vows that they'd written together during quiet evenings in the penthouse. When Marco promised to honor her intelligence, celebrate her achievements, and stand beside her as an equal partner in all their endeavors, Zara felt the last of her protective walls dissolve completely. When Zara vowed to embrace his family's history while building new traditions together, to support his growth while maintaining her own independence, Marco understood that he was gaining not just a wife, but a true partner in every aspect of life. The reception celebration continued late into the night, with Marco's business associates mingling easily with Zara's academic colleagues and artist friends. Watching Vincent Torino offer genuine congratulations and respectful compliments on Zara's gallery renovation, Marco marveled at how completely their world had transformed. Former enemies had become respectful acquaintances, family tensions had resolved into genuine affection, and the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had simply melted away in the face of authentic love. But the most significant moment came during Marco's toast to his new wife, when he addressed the gathered crowd with the kind of honest vulnerability that his old self would never have considered. 6 months ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the elegant space, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted for my future. I had narrow ideas about what belonged in my world, what would bring honor to my family, what would create the kind of life worth living. He turned to look at Zara, who was watching him with obvious love and pride. Then I met Zara, and she proved me wrong about everything I thought I believed. She showed me that real beauty comes from intelligence and courage and compassion. That true partnership means challenging each other to grow rather than simply confirming existing prejudices. That love worthy of the name requires the humility to change when change makes you better. The room was completely quiet as Marco's words sunk in, recognition dawning that this was more than a wedding toast. This was a public acknowledgement of transformation, a commitment to different values than he'd once held. To my wife, Marco continued, raising his champagne glass. Thank you for proving that the heart wants what the heart wants, regardless of what the mind thinks it should want. Thank you for loving me enough to challenge my assumptions and for being patient enough to let me catch up with your wisdom. The applause was thunderous, but Zara only heard her own heartbeat as she stood to kiss her husband, overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Their honeymoon in Sicily was everything romantic dreams were made of, but returning to Chicago and building their daily life together proved even more satisfying. Marco had insisted on moving into a larger penthouse that could accommodate both their needs, with space for Zara's art books and restoration equipment alongside his business requirements and security considerations. The gallery reopening 3 months after the wedding marked Zara's emergence as one of Chicago's most influential cultural figures. Her exhibition featuring emerging African-American artists alongside classical masters drew international attention and established her reputation far beyond the local art scene. Marco attended every opening, every lecture, every professional event, his obvious pride and support making clear that he considered her success as important as his own. But it was the domestic moments that revealed the depth of their partnership. Marco cooking elaborate Sunday dinners for their combined families, Zara editing his speeches for legitimate business ventures, both of them navigating the complex balance between his traditional world and her professional ambitions with patience and humor. The pregnancy discovery came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, confirmed by a test Zara took on impulse after several days of unusual fatigue. She sat in their bathroom for 20 minutes, staring at the positive result and marveling at how completely her life had transformed from the woman who'd been afraid to trust anyone enough for this kind of vulnerability. Marco's reaction was everything she could have hoped for and more. When she showed him the test, he sat down heavily on their bed with an expression of wonder that gradually transformed into pure joy. Are you happy? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. I know we hadn't specifically planned for this timeline, and your career is just hitting its stride, and timing is never perfect, but Zara silenced him with a kiss that communicated everything words couldn't. She was happy, completely, overwhelmingly happy, ready to build a family with the man who'd proven capable of growth and change and unconditional love. The months that followed were a blur of gallery exhibitions, family celebrations, and quiet evenings spent planning nursery designs and discussing parenting philosophies. Marco's protectiveness increased exponentially with Zara's pregnancy, but he managed to express it through supportive gestures rather than controlling restrictions. When Zara insisted on continuing her work throughout pregnancy, Marco arranged for discreet security without interfering with her professional autonomy. When she wanted to travel for art acquisitions, he accompanied her without making her feel dependent or incapable. Every challenge they faced together strengthened their partnership rather than creating tension. The baby arrived on a snowy February evening, after 12 hours of labor that tested both their endurance and their trust in each other. Marco's presence throughout delivery was everything Zara had hoped for. Steady, supportive, completely focused on her needs and comfort. When their daughter finally made her appearance, screaming with healthy lungs and waving tiny fists in indignation at the bright world, both parents were overwhelmed by the intensity of immediate love. "She's perfect," Marco whispered, carefully holding his daughter for the first time. "Look at those eyes, Zara. She has your intelligence already, I can tell." Zara laughed through exhausted tears. "She's 5 minutes old, Marco. Give her time to develop personality before you start attributing character traits." But privately, she agreed. Their daughter was perfect, beautiful in ways that transcended any artificial standard of appearance. She was the living proof that love could create something extraordinary when it was based on genuine partnership and mutual respect. They named her Rosa Elena, honoring both grandmothers while giving her a name that belonged completely to the new generation they were creating. The gallery's spring exhibition 6 months later featured the work of 5 emerging artists whose careers Zara had championed since before Rosa's birth. The opening night was packed with collectors, critics, and cultural enthusiasts who'd come to see what Chicago's newest power couple was promoting. Marco moved through the crowd with obvious pride, discussing the featured artwork with genuine knowledge and enthusiasm. Watching him engage seriously with artists and collectors who came from completely different backgrounds than his traditional world, Zara marveled again at his capacity for growth and adaptation. But the moment that crystallized everything for her came when a prominent collector made a dismissive comment about supporting minority artists for political reasons rather than aesthetic merit. Art should be valued for beauty and technical skill, not social agendas, the older man said, clearly expecting Marco to agree based on their shared background. Marco's response was immediate and uncompromising. "Beauty comes in infinite forms, and part of my education has been learning to recognize excellence wherever it appears rather than limiting myself to familiar styles. These artists deserve support because their work is extraordinary, not because of their background. Though I'd argue that diverse perspectives often create the most innovative and challenging art." The collector retreated with obvious embarrassment, and Zara felt her love for her husband deepen even further. He wasn't just tolerating her professional world. He was becoming a genuine advocate for the values and principles that mattered to her. Later that evening, as they stood together in their penthouse nursery watching Rosa sleep peacefully in her crib, Marco wrapped his arms around Zara from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Vincent hadn't attacked the gallery that night?" he asked quietly. "If we'd just been 2 people who met briefly at an art opening and then went back to our separate worlds?" Zara leaned back against his warmth, considering the question seriously. "I think we would have found each other eventually. Maybe not that night, maybe not that month, but eventually. Some connections are too strong to miss forever." Marco's arms tightened around her. "I hope you're right. I hate to think I might have let prejudice and fear keep me from the best thing that ever happened to me." "You didn't," Zara pointed out. "When it mattered, when you had to choose between your old beliefs and something real and true, you chose truth. That's what I fell in love with, that capacity for courage when it counted." As they stood together watching their sleeping daughter and planning tomorrow's gallery events and next month's family dinner, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful moment. The external threats had been resolved, the family acceptance had been earned, their professional partnership had flourished beyond expectations. But more than any of that, they'd proved that love could transform even the most entrenched prejudices when it was based on genuine respect and willingness to grow. Marco had become not just a better partner, but a better man. She'd learned to trust her own worth enough to demand the kind of love she deserved. Their wedding photo sat on the nursery dresser, showing 2 people radiating genuine happiness and hard-won wisdom. Looking at it, Zara could see not just the love they'd found together, but the proof that beauty truly comes in infinite forms when hearts are open enough to recognize it. As she turned in Marco's arms to kiss him goodnight, Zara thought about how wrong his initial prejudices had been, how limited his vision of beauty and worth had once seemed. Now, building a life together that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new, they were living proof that the most beautiful love stories begin when people have the courage to see beyond their assumptions. Have you ever had to confront your own assumptions about love, about beauty, about who belongs in your world? Sometimes the most transformative relationships are the ones that challenge us to grow beyond what we thought we wanted and discover what we actually need. Love really can conquer prejudice, but only when we're brave enough to let it change us. Their daughter stirred in her sleep, and both parents smiled, knowing they were raising her in a world where beauty would be defined by character rather than appearance, where love would be measured by partnership rather than conformity, where the future held infinite possibilities for those wise enough to embrace them.